Apparently, loss adjustment is a lot like detective work. Here's a relevant syllogism. Everyone loves good detective stories. Some games are good detective stories. Therefore, everyone loves some games. Logical deduction, assuming the first two are true, but while some games are good detective stories, how many are good examples of detective work as a playable game? Hard to say. If you ask me, it's not worth stressing over whether something is technically more visual novel than game or vice versa, they're just labels. And yet there's something to be said for games that are more game-like. In theory, utilising the medium to its fullest potential should lead to new heights. This is the commonality between Papers, Please and Obra Dinn. Both are non-traditional gameplay concepts, fully gamified. Papers, Please even had a randomised endless mode to tackle. It doesn't get more gamey than that. I can't think of a detective game more game-like than Obra Dinn, and maybe it's mostly a case of trimming the fat. Rather than being spoon-fed facts, you're left to assess them for yourself. As a result, the logic of it all unfolds entirely within your own mind. It's all killers, almost no filler. Yes, the initial introduction to each death might last a little long, but that seems like a necessary evil to combat inattentiveness in some players. Overall, it's 60 murder mysteries in the time it might take another game to do just a few. Even the tutorial is an excellent example of streamlining. For such a complicated and innovative premise, Obra Dinn manages to introduce tons of information in a short span without explicitly spelling it out. In the first 15 minutes you'll learn, cause of death will probably be easy, identities difficult. It's not possible to identify everyone immediately. Locked doors will open when they open in a memory, events will not be presented linearly, chapters are not self-contained, and there's more going on than just a bunch of murders. Obviously impressive, but maybe this clean tutorial was achieved by designing around it rather than vice versa. Fates are validated in threes, and I suspect one reason it works this way is because a more complex approach would be more difficult to explain. Whatever the reason, the triple validation method is both clever, but not clever enough. Once you figure out how it works, it's possible to solve 2 deaths by yourself, find another cause of death which is usually obvious, then click every reasonable name on the manifest until the answer validates. To be clear, I never did this on my first playthrough. Obra Dinn is the kind of game you can only fully experience once, and I was keenly aware of that setting out, so if anything, I was overly cautious about which information I committed to ink. Still, a system where players need to police themselves is a system with room for improvement. Few other parts of Obra Dinn show such room for improvement. Considering the sheer number of fates to solve and what a limited setting a ship is, it's commendable how little redundancy there is between challenges. Every little avenue for puzzle solving seems to be capitalised on. While most causes of death are obvious, a few aren't. Some people disappear, some others escape. Every minor intricacy such as titles, nationalities, first names, last names, positions, living quarters, clothing, relationships to each other, everything, it's all useful without becoming repetitive. The only whiff of missed potential is the hanging, where it turns out that Huck Sen Lao really is the guy with the bag over his head. Even the overall narrative unfolds well. A simple introduction gives way to a massive Kraken attack with at least one more surprise saved for later when the giant enemy crabs arrive. This is a truly brilliant moment because you're trapped behind a wall, meaning you can only get a restrictive view of them at first. Inevitably, this leads to the startling realization that there's some kind of humanoid figure on top of them, well camouflaged by the visual style. The reverse chronological presentation hampers the final chapter somewhat since it reveals the most significant detail first before dwelling on a few other events of lesser importance, but apart from that minor problem, the ending closes out well. It must have been tempting to cop out by showing a simple complete or incomplete congratulatory scene, but instead the player's decisions are fully honoured by the insurance forms. The choice to skip forward in time only to go back through the watch is also a genius one. There's something cathartic about sitting in front of a cup of tea only to wind up on the Obra Dinn one last time. It's the kind of full-circle, novelesque storytelling you'd hope for. Although the one-bit ye old-timey visuals will be a turn-off for some, there's no question they're a suitable choice given the subject matter. It's as though the game is nothing more than a million illustrations in some leather-bound book. Filtering our viewpoint through this context allows for highly detailed faces to coexist alongside more simplistic environments and clothing, since that's what an artist's impression might reasonably focus on. It could be argued that the lack of detail is also a crucial part of the challenge. Consider how much this bag and pipe would stick out if everything was in full colour. Lucas might have had to clutter the ship with hundreds more meaningless details in order to disguise the important bits, which would be impractical for a single developer and possibly result in a worse game overall. Complementing those visuals is some equally impressive sound design, which can be summarised as music substituting for effects. This lends some much needed whimsy to the morbid act of traversing a ghost ship and delving into another corpse. The soundtrack continues this theme, with the leading instrument usually played staccato, which implies some sort of action in the scene, like what would accompany a ballet. Using an organ, it sounds tragically inept. With strings, it might evoke the idea of purposeful movement. And with a deep wind instrument, it can represent impending doom. It's the sea shanty underscore to a silent film stuck on a single frame. This might help players more easily visualize how a scene came to be and what probably happened afterwards, but if nothing else, it's yet another inspired stylistic choice. Same goes for the titular book itself. Lucas has a knack for presenting varied information in a clear, easy to understand manner. Not to undersell the amount of iterative work which must have gone into shaving it down to the bare essentials, but at least some of this can be attributed to simple consistency. Page layouts and the content within them remain predictable from start to finish. For example, if a certain person has no accessible corpse, the same section of the book remains in place, only the text changes. As a player, knowing that you'll be interacting with this one consistent menu for the entire game is a powerful incentive to invest more time and energy into understanding it. About the only lingering user experience complaint is how cumbersome it sometimes is to get back into a specific memory. That could be alleviated by allowing players to open the stopwatch on any person as long as they've already seen how they died, but maybe this idea was rejected since progress is sometimes necessary in the present rather than the past. You might say Lucas committed the perfect design with this game. Or so it seemed. Yes, he would have got away with it, but he left one small clue which got me thinking. The difficulty level above each crew portrait is described as a deduction rating, but Obra Dinn isn't a game of deduction, it's a game of induction. There's one Persian guy on the manifest. You could probably identify him at the beginning just based on his appearance, but great detective work isn't founded on hasty assumptions, so it's better to hold out for more information. Next to his assigned cot there's a unique falchion, and during the Soldiers of the Sea chapter this guy can be found wielding it. Now, you might conclude he's the Persian. It's the right answer, but how sure are you of that? Maybe the Persian slept in another bed and the sword belonged to this guy. Maybe the sword doesn't belong to him and he just happened to grab it as he ran past. Maybe the Persian was already dead by this point and this guy just won possession of his belongings. All of these scenarios are unlikely, but possible, and combined they represent reasonable doubt. Or at least they would if the jury was made up of me and 11 clones. If you think about it robotically enough, you can come up with an excuse like this for the majority of the crew members. As far as I can tell, the only way to work out the identity of the Chinese top men is to look at their shoes, but it's not so unreasonable to think that two of them swapped cots at the beginning of the voyage for whatever reason. Now you might say this doesn't matter. Even though the tutorial touts Obra Dinn as a deduction game, that's unimportant as long as the game is good, and you'd be mostly right. The game isn't just good, it's great, and the introduction is upfront about the fact that decisive information is rare. I'm not making a point about false advertising, it's just an important distinction because induction is less satisfying than deduction. Before we continue, here's the distinction I'm making. Syllogisms work by deduction, the most famous example being this one. All plumbers are mortal. Mario is a plumber, therefore Mario is mortal. Deduction takes facts and uses those facts to reach a conclusion. If the first two statements are true, then it follows that the third statement is also true. Now here's one that doesn't work. One of the top men is from Papua New Guinea. Papuans often have chest tattoos, therefore this tattooed top man is from Papua New Guinea. Even if the first two statements are true, the third isn't necessarily. Papers, Please was built on deduction. There's a certainty governing the rules to documents so that if you find a contradiction, there's no question an infraction has occurred. Now, Papers, Please toys with this concept in a genius way by insinuating that some people have legitimate documents with typographical errors, while others illegitimate documents which are indistinguishable from the real thing. Some seemingly good people should be refused entry and some seemingly bad people should be allowed. Taking that wider view introduces enough ambiguity for moral quandaries to shine. Despite that, our job is to examine documents and ensure they conform to a set of rules. If you disregard all other concerns, which you're tempted to do since you're paid on commission, it's possible to perform that job without making any mistakes, day in, day out. This isn't unique to Papers, Please. As a character, Phoenix Wright might postulate some unlikely scenarios well before they can be proven, but as a player, our only task is to find contradictory statements. In that case, induction is handled by the narrative, but most of the gameplay is deduction. Certainty is appealing, which is probably why we jump to conclusions in the first place, maybe because it means a problem can be crossed out as one less burden to think about. Obra Dinn demonstrates this principle itself. Most players probably feel a wave of relief when the assessment kicks in to congratulate them on solving 3 more fates. It's nice to know your conclusions are concrete, but that feeling is generated by some invisible arbiter, not the player themselves. A completely logical version of Obra Dinn would spark this satisfaction naturally by allowing a cautious, rigorous player to solve all 58 mysteries without any doubts or external validation. Right now, that's not possible. Don't misunderstand me here, it is possible to get all 58 correct even by blind chance, but no matter how thorough you are, you couldn't be absolutely sure of your findings until you stepped off the ship and were presented with the facts. The question I'm raising is whether or not that makes Obra Dinn a flawed premise. Even the best modern-day investigations often conclude with some small margin of error. Fingerprints can and have been mismatched. Identical twins share identical DNA. It could be said that in order to accurately evoke the experience of being a detective, some level of induction is necessary, but this prosecution would like to present 2 problems with that defense. First of all, the magical watch already makes Obra Dinn a huge departure from real detective work, although you could just ignore the 19th century setting and imagine it as a stand-in for crime scene recreation techniques. Secondly, and more importantly, Obra Dinn is fiction, which can't help but change how players will perceive it. Any twists and turns in real life are just a matter of chance, whereas a game carries the expectation that at least a few things will be less straightforward than they initially appear. Almost every story ever written is about something which is unusual in some way, otherwise it wouldn't capture our attention. This is why Obra Dinn is about a ghost ship and not all the other investigations our character did before or after. Credit to Lucas, he manages to pull off several surprises without resorting to misleading information. For example, everyone's visual ethnicity lines up with their nationality in not just plausible ways, but likely ways. Even when an event is less straightforward than it initially appears, it's still in keeping with previously learned information. For example, it's obvious that Huk Sen Lao is executed, it's less obvious that only a single bullet hit the mark, but you should be able to understand that as a possibility the moment the scene appears. As far as puzzle solving goes, there's no especially sneaky or nonsensical twists, but you don't know that until you're finished. As much as I admire this game, I think we can all agree it has low replay value, which is fine, but it means you can't let go of the expectation that Lucas will pull a fast one on you until it's too late. In other words, induction may be how it works in real life, but fiction is arbitrary in a way reality never can be. The amount of evidence necessary to make a correct decision changes depending on whether or not the author wants to throw you a curveball. Even though this game never really does, the knowledge that everything is fabricated can undermine the kind of satisfaction induction is capable of inducing in real life. With that in mind, maybe it really would have been best to craft a challenge which could be derived entirely by deductive reasoning. All of this is to say that Obra Dinn is a near flawless rendition of its concept, but maybe that particular idea isn't the best thing to strive for. It's a petty complaint, but less petty than it first appears. If you think it over, hopefully you'll feel I'm justified in giving Obra Dinn a potentially slightly misguided out of 10. It wouldn't be surprising to find a wave of games follow in Obra Dinn's wake. It's fair to say it sets a new standard for the detective genre, exactly the kind of high-quality game you'd hope for from the creator of Papers, Please. Lucas Pope is 2 for 2 on innovative, fully fleshed out games that will be inspiring others for years to come. In many ways, Obra Dinn is even more impressive than his last outing, but there's also some small gap that's not quite airtight. Of course, most vessels take on water from time to time, that's just the reality of setting sail. What matters is whether or not they manage to stay above the waves. In spite of everything thrown at it, the Obra Dinn is still standing. All things considered, I'd have to say it's an admirably sturdy flagship.